He thought the employee was stealing from him, but when he followed him disguised as a driver, the truth brought him to his knees. Hook! Arthur believed that success was born from distrust, and that loyalty had a price he could always pay. Owner of a steel empire, he never imagined that the disappearance of small sums from his personal account would lead him to investigate David, his most loyal employee for 15 years. Dressed as a simple driver and hidden under the brim of a cap, Arthur followed David through streets that wealth usually ignores. What he expected was to catch a robbery. What he found, in a humble 2-story house under the yellowish light of a lamppost, was a secret kept in silence that would make him fall to his knees and question the value of every penny he had accumulated in life. The 40th floor of the Miller Industries headquarters building was a sanctuary of marble and silence, where Arthur spent most of his hours. The afternoon sun beat down on the tinted windows, but the heat didn't penetrate. Arthur, at 65, had a face sculpted by decades of ruthless decisions. He stared at the bank statement printed on his mahogany desk as if it were an enigma. $500. Another $500 the previous week. Another $400 the week before that. Insignificant amounts for someone who made millions, but for Arthur, every dollar was a soldier, and he didn't tolerate deserters. David, Arthur's voice, hoarse from overuse of command, echoed through the intercom. In less than 30 seconds, the oak door opened. David entered with his usual posture, discreet, almost invisible. He was 58 years old, but looked older. His suits were impeccable, though slightly worn at the cuffs, and he carried a leather diary containing Arthur's entire life, organized into schedules and reminders. David was more than an assistant. He was Arthur's shadow. He knew how the boss liked his coffee, the name of every supplier, and even the birthdays Arthur preferred to forget. "Yes, Mr. Miller?" David asked, keeping a respectful distance. Arthur swiveled his chair slowly. He observed David's face. Something was wrong. The assistant had deep dark circles under his eyes, and his hands, usually steady, were nervously fidgeting with the corner of his planner. "David, I've noticed some discrepancies in my ATM expenses. Withdrawals made outside of business hours, in neighborhoods I've never visited. You have my backup password for emergencies, right?" The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Arthur's wall clock, an old pendulum model, struck the time with an oppressive force. David swallowed hard. His eyes darted for a millisecond to the floor before meeting Arthur's again. I didn't use your card, Mr. Miller, if there were any withdrawals. Perhaps we should contact the bank security immediately. I can draft the email right now." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't fear, it was a feeling of betrayal. He had known David for 15 years. He had watched the man grow old by his side. If David was lying, what else in his empire would be real? "That won't be necessary, David. I'll take care of it myself. You can go for today. Go home early. You look exhausted." David nodded, gave a small bow, and left. But Arthur didn't return to work. He waited until the sun set, and the city lights began to twinkle below. He went to the closet in his private suite in the office and took out a gray twill jacket, dark jeans, and a driver's cap that belonged to one of the garage employees. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He went down in the service elevator, avoiding the security guards at reception. In the garage, he didn't take his Rolls-Royce or the Bentley. He chose an ordinary black sedan, used for transporting documents, a car that would go unnoticed anywhere. He parked 2 blocks from David's building, a simple apartment on the outskirts of the city. About an hour later, David left. He was no longer in a suit. He was wearing sweatpants and an old nylon jacket. He seemed to be in a hurry. He got into a small, old model car and drove off. Arthur followed him, keeping a safe distance, his heart pounding at a rate he hadn't felt in years. They crossed the city, leaving the brightly lit avenues and entering suburbs where the asphalt was potholed and the facades of the houses had peeling paint. David stopped in front of a red brick building that looked like an old warehouse converted into some kind of community center. Arthur stopped the car in the dim light, pulling down the brim of his cap. He saw David get out, carrying a heavy backpack. He looked around nervously and knocked on a side door. A burly man opened the door, exchanged a few words with David, and let him in. Arthur felt his anger rising. So this is it, he thought. Illegal gambling? Some kind of betting scheme. He waited 10 minutes and decided to get out of the car. The night air was cold, and the smell of burnt oil and garbage was strong in the area. He walked to the metal door, feeling the weight of the humiliation of having to chase his own employee like a detective in a police movie. He pressed his ear to the cold door. What he heard wasn't the shouts of gamblers or loud music. It was low voices, the sound of cutlery clattering against plates, and the distant crying of a child. Without thinking about the consequences, Arthur turned the doorknob. The door was ajar. What he saw as he entered left him paralyzed under the dim light of a fluorescent lamp flickering on the high ceiling. Arthur pushed open the metal door, which creaked to an agonizing sound, echoing to the vast, high-ceiling hall. The interior of the shed was not the den of iniquity he had imagined. There was no cigarette smoke, nor the metallic clang of gambling machines. Instead, the place was filled with long plywood tables, illuminated by pendant lamps that swayed slightly in the air current. The smell that dominated the room was a mixture of vegetable soup, cheap disinfectant, and the metallic odor of recent rain. Arthur, still in his chauffeur's uniform with his cap pulled down, stood in the shadows of an iron column. He saw David in the center of the hall. The impeccably dressed office assistant now wore a stained apron over his jacket, serving bowls of soup to a line of people who looked as if they had emerged from a nightmare of invisibility. There were elderly people in worn clothes, mothers holding small children who barely had shoes, and young men with empty stares, marked by the defeat of the streets. David didn't just serve the food. He touched people on the shoulder, asked about someone's health, about the whereabouts of another's child. Arthur felt a strange lump in his throat. He watched David open his backpack, the same one Arthur thought was full of stolen money or illegal merchandise, and take out packages of diapers, basic medicines, and small plastic toys. "Here you go, Mrs. Higgins," David said to a hunched-over woman. "I got the syrup for your cough. And here are the woolen socks I promised. This winter is going to be harsh." The woman held David's hands, and Arthur saw, for the first time in 15 years, an expression on his assistant's face that he had never seen in the office, a deep, almost divine peace. But Arthur's mind was still driven by business logic. Where does the money for all this come from? He wondered. $500 a week doesn't buy everything I'm seeing here. He must have other bosses, or the embezzlement is much greater than I've discovered. Arthur decided to approach, circling the edges of the shed so as not to be noticed. He came near the area that served as a small, makeshift pantry. There, he saw the burly man who had opened the door for David. He was checking some invoices. "David, my friend," the man said, approaching Arthur's assistant. "You can't keep doing this. The rent for this place has gone up again. The groceries are twice the price. I know you put every penny of your salary here, but you're killing yourself. Look at you, you're pale. You haven't even eaten today, have you?" David smiled, a sad and weary smile. "I'm fine, Frank. As long as I have a job with Mr. Miller, I'll be able to keep this place open. He's a difficult man, but he pays well for my loyalty. Those withdrawals I make from his account, I feel like I'm betraying his trust, but he doesn't even miss the money. To him, $500 is dust. To these children, it's the difference between going to bed hungry or not." Frank shook his head. "He'll find out one day, David. And men like Arthur Miller don't forgive. They crush anyone who deceives them. You're risking your freedom for people who don't even know your last name." "I don't need them to know my name, Frank. I need them to survive," David replied, resuming serving the soup. "Mr. Miller lives in a castle of steel and glass. He's forgotten what the cold of the sidewalk feels like. If I'm the price for keeping the shed open, so be it. I lost my family to poverty years ago. I won't let it happen to others while I can prevent it." Arthur, hidden behind a pile of boxes, felt the impact of those words as if he'd been physically punched. He looked at his own hands, the hands that signed million-dollar contracts but had never served a bowl of soup. He remembered all the times he'd been rude to David, all the times he had demanded that he stay late on a whim, without ever asking if he had a life beyond those marble walls. Arthur's anger vanished, replaced by a feeling of shame that burned more intensely than hatred. However, the instinct for control still spoke loudly. He needed to know the full extent of the crime. He needed to know if David was merely a saint or a thief with a clear conscience. Arthur took a misstep. knocking over an aluminum can that was on the floor. The noise was like a gunshot in the silence of the shed. David and Frank instantly looked in the direction of the shadows. "Who's there?" Frank shouted, walking toward Arthur. "This is private property. Get out now or we'll call the police." Arthur stepped back, but tripped over a wooden pallet. He tried to pull his cap down even further, but it was too late. Frank caught up with him and grabbed him by his jacket, dragging him into the center of the light. "A spy?" Frank growled. "What do you want here? Were you trying to steal the little food we have?" David approached, his face tense. He looked at the man lying on the ground, at the soiled chauffeur's uniform, and then his eyes met Arthur's. The recognition was immediate. David's face went white as paper, and the ladle he was holding fell to ground, spilling soup all over the wood. "Mr. Miller?" David whispered, his voice faltering. "Were you how?" The silence that followed the discovery was more deafening than any explosion. Frank, the burly man, dropped Arthur's jacket as if he had touched a burning ember, taking 2 steps back when he saw the terror etched on David's face. People at the table stopped eating. The children, sensing the sudden shift in energy, clung to their mother's clothes. Arthur Miller, the man who commanded the fate of thousands of employees, lay there, sprawled on a damp wooden pallet, wearing a driver's uniform that barely fit him, under the roof of a warehouse he didn't even know existed. Arthur stood up slowly. His knees creaked, and he felt each of his 65 years weigh upon him. He removed his cap, revealing perfectly combed gray hair that contrasted sharply with the grime of the surroundings. He brushed the dust off his trousers with a mechanical gesture, trying to recover a dignity that seemed to have been left outside that metal door. "So this is where my money ends up, David?" Arthur's voice didn't come out with its usual thunderous command, but with a tired hoarseness, almost a whisper that cut through the air. David stepped forward, his trembling hands hidden beneath his stained apron. He seemed to shrink before his boss. "Mr. Miller, I intended to return it. Every penny. I was saving a portion of my salary, but the emergencies never stopped. Mrs. Higgins needed her medicine. Little Toby had nothing to eat. I couldn't look at you every day and see the waste of paper and luxury, while these people freeze to death here 3 miles from your tower." Frank, regaining his voice, intervened with desperate courage. "Don't blame David. He's the only reason this place still exists. If you want to arrest someone, arrest me. I'm in charge of the warehouse." He only tried to save those the city chose to ignore. Arthur ignored Frank. His eyes were fixed on David, scanning the assistant as if trying to find the stranger inhabiting that familiar body. He walked slowly through the hall, observing the soup bowls, the donated blankets, and the faces of the people who stared at him with fear and distrust. He stopped before a table where a girl of about 5 years old held a patched rag doll. She looked at Arthur with large, dark eyes. "Did you come to help Uncle David, too?" the girl asked, with the innocence that only childhood allows. Arthur felt a tightness in his chest that no financial crisis had ever caused him. He looked at David, who lowered his head, awaiting the verdict. Arthur knew what he should do according to his old self. Call the police, fire the traitor, and sue everyone involved to recover what was his. The business world was made of rules, and David had broken the most sacred of all, the owner's trust. "You said I live in a glass castle, David," said Arthur, turning to his assistant. "You said I'd forgotten the cold of the sidewalk." "I shouldn't have said that, sir. It was just tiredness talking," David murmured, too afraid to hold his gaze. "But you were right," Arthur retorted, surprising everyone. "I looked at my bank statements and saw numbers. I never saw the people behind them. To me, $500 was just an accounting error that needed correcting. I didn't know that $500 could buy hope." Arthur walked over to the table where David was serving. He glanced at the ladle lying on the floor and the still steaming pot of soup. The tension in the shed was almost palpable. David had been expecting the announcement of his dismissal, the public humiliation, the end of his career. Instead, Arthur reached out and picked up a clean ladle from the counter. "Frank, right?" Arthur looked at the burly man. "You said the rent went up. How much are we talking about? And what are the current debts of this place?" David stepped forward, confused. "Mr. Miller, what are you doing?" Arthur dipped the ladle into the pot and served the next person in line, an elderly gentleman who was visibly trembling. I'm doing what I should have done 15 years ago, David. I'm getting to know my neighbors. But first, I want you to show me the accounting books for this shed. If you're going to steal from me, at least learn to do it on a scale that actually makes a difference. The tears David had been holding back finally overflowed. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The ruthless boss was there, serving soup, his chauffeur's jacket stained, acting as if the warehouse were his new meeting room. But the moment of redemption was interrupted by a bang at the front door. Two men in dark suits, with cold expressions, entered the warehouse. They were the property owners, accompanied by a bailiff. "Time's up, Frank," shouted one of the men. "The new buyer of the land demands immediate evacuation. We have a demolition order for tomorrow at 6 a.m. Everyone out now." The silence that followed the threat of eviction was broken only by the soft crying of the little girl Arthur had just met. The two men in suits strode through the warehouse with the arrogance of those holding the signed document, ignoring the human misery around them. David took a step forward, his soup-stained hands outstretched in a pleading gesture, but the men didn't even look him in the eye. "Please, sir, just one more week. We have elderly people here who wouldn't survive a night out in the open in this frost," David pleaded, his voice choked with emotion. "The contract is expired. The notices have been sent, and the bulldozer is already on its way," replied the taller man, adjusting the gold watch on his wrist. "This land is worth 10 times more as a luxury parking lot for the new stadium than as this charity dump. Get out, all of you." Arthur, who remained in the shadows, observing the scene with the ladle still in his hand, felt a surge of fury he didn't recognize. He recognized a man in the suit. He was a third-rate real estate agent who used to beg for crumbs in the waiting rooms of his companies. The billionaire walked slowly towards the light, wiping his hands on the apron David had lent him. "Did you say demolition at 6 a.m? Arthur asked, his voice taking on that steely tone that made bank presidents tremble. The broker laughed, looking Arthur up and down, seeing only an old and tired driver. "That's right, Grandpa. If I were you, I'd grab my lunchbox and get out of here before the police arrive to forcibly remove this human trash. Who do you think you are to question me?" Arthur pulled his cell phone from his driver's jacket pocket. He didn't yell. He didn't make empty threats. He simply dialed a number that few people in the country had. "Hello, Harrison?" "Yes, it's me. Arthur Miller. Sorry to call you on your Sunday dinner date. I want you to buy West End properties. Now." "No, I don't want a feasibility report. I want the deed to the warehouse on 42nd Street on my digital desk in 10 minutes. Pay triple the market value. If they refuse, by the bank that finances their operations." Silence reigned once more, but this time charged with an electric shock. The broker paled, his cell phone almost slipping from his sweaty hand as he watched the name Arthur Miller flash on the screen in an urgent notification from his headquarters. He looked at the man in the gray uniform and began to tremble. "Mr. Miller? You in this neighborhood?" The man's tone instantly shifted to groveling submission. "There's been a misunderstanding. We didn't know this place had your protection." "This place doesn't have my protection," Arthur interrupted, walking over to David and placing his hand on his shoulder. "This place is my new headquarters. David, you're fired from your assistant position. Starting tomorrow, you're the executive director of the Miller Foundation for Social Welfare. And Frank, you're going to need more staff because we're doubling the size of this warehouse before the end of the month." David looked at Arthur, tears washing down his face, marked by the weariness of years of secrets. He tried to say something, but no words came. He simply squeezed his boss's hand, a hand he now realized was as human as his own. "Now, get off my property," Arthur told the real estate agents without even looking at them. "And take the bulldozers with you. If I see a demolition machine on this street tomorrow, I'll make sure the only thing demolished in this state is your careers." When the men had fled, the little girl approached Arthur again and tugged at the sleeve of his jacket. "Are you an angel?" she asked. Arthur Miller, the steel giant who had never bowed to anyone, knelt slowly on the cold concrete floor. He looked at the girl's hands, then at David, and finally at a crowd of faces that now looked at him with hope, not fear. The weight of his armor of arrogance finally fell away. No, little one, Arthur whispered, his voice breaking for the first time in decades. I'm just a man who took too long to learn how to see. The morning light found no sound of tractors or the chaos of demolition. Instead, the Ohio sun rose over a street that, for the first time in decades, did not feel the weight of oblivion. The red brick warehouse, which had once seemed a tomb for abandoned dreams, was now surrounded by trucks carrying not iron balls, but loads of groceries, new mattresses, and renovation crews. The entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, watching the transformation unfold on that small patch of land. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was one of feverish activity, but quiet and respectful. Arthur Miller was still wearing the same gray driver's jacket, though now it was accompanied by a hot coffee and a stack of legal documents on an improvised wooden table. He hadn't returned to his penthouse. He'd spent the night awake, sitting on a wooden bench, talking to Frank about logistics and listening to the life stories he'd spent 60 years ignoring. David approached, carrying a tray of fresh bread. He no longer wore his stained apron, but clean shirt, though his eyes still carried the accumulated weariness of years of secrets. He stopped before Arthur, hesitating for a moment before placing the breakfast on the table. Mr. Miller, the legal team called. The property transfer is complete. The warehouse now officially belongs to the foundation. The brokers from last night have been relieved of their duties, David said, his voice still wavering, as if he feared it was all a dream that would vanish with the brightest light of the sun. Arthur looked up from the papers. He observed David. The man he had thought to be a thief was, in fact, the architect of a dignity that Arthur's money had never been able to buy.